Hey guys, it's really nice to be talking to you again, and I'm making this right before our Wednesday Zoom, so I'm looking forward to seeing you all and talking to you about yourselves and your lives and finding out what's been going on with you. This is another Saint of the Week video, and the Saint of the Week this week is a saint who was really for most of the period of his life. He died at the age of 23, so he was a young man and a boy while he was a saint, and so I thought he would be a good person for you to think about and pray to. His name is Saint Aloysius Gonzaga. Saint Aloysius Gonzaga. He lived in 16th century Italy. Remember, the 16th century is all those years beginning with 15. You always have to subtract 1 from the name of the century. So if it's the 16th century, which this is, it's all those years beginning with 15. So 1501 or 1562 or 1552 or 1593, all those are 16th century dates. So he lived in 16th century Italy, late 16th century Italy, near the great city of Florence. He was born into a rich family. You know, some of the saints that we've thought about, like Saint Joan of Arc, for example, were born into very poor families, but many of them were also born into rich families, and they had to learn to, in a way, become poor in order to serve God. So St. Aloysius was born into a rich family, which had a lot of things. They were not only rich, they were a very powerful family. And St. Aloysius's father wanted him to be in the army and to be a great general, because that was considered a very glorious kind of life back then. When he was 7 years old, when Aloysius was 7 years old, he fell in love with God, and he started to pray. And not many of the people in his family spent a lot of time praying, but he did. And he took it very, very seriously. He prayed prayers from the Bible, psalms, and other kinds of prayers that he found in the Bible much of the day, all day long. When he was age 9, he went to the big city of Florence in order to go to school. And by the time he was 11 years old, he was still praying and doing taking his religion very seriously. He was teaching the Catholic faith to younger children, poor children from the neighborhoods around his school. And that's called teaching catechism, and he was teaching catechism to the younger children from the poor neighborhoods around his school. He continued to spend much of his day praying, and he would fast 3 days a week. This is something that he started earlier in his life. When he fasted, he would only drink a little bit of water and eat a little bit of bread, and that's all he ate and drank all day long on the fasting days, and he did that 3 days a week. When he prayed, he liked to kneel on the stone floor of his room. In our rooms, a lot of our rooms, we have rugs and comfortable things, but the floor of his room was stone, and it was cold and it was hard, and he liked to kneel on the floor and pray because, well, you're familiar with this idea of doing penance. If you take away the things that you crave, like food or fun or comfort, then it's easier most of the time to concentrate on God, because the things that we crave, the things that feel good, or the things that attract us, they can lead us in the other direction. We can use them well, but they can also pull us away and teach us to use them badly and to forget about God. So the saints always try to give up the things that make them comfortable and happy so that they can concentrate better on God. And St. Aloysius was very good at this even when he was a young boy. So he would kneel on the stone floor for hours when he wanted to pray. And when it was cold outside, they didn't have heating like we do now. They had fireplaces in every room. And a lot of the time, even when it was cold outside, he didn't have a fire lit in his room. He was rich, right? And so he had servants that would do these things for him. But he told them not to light a fire in his room so that he could be uncomfortable. Not because he wanted to be uncomfortable, but because by giving up the comforts and fun things of life, he could concentrate better on God. When he was 13 years old, his rich family took him to visit the royal family in Austria that governed them. And this, of course, was a great and marvelous royal court with lots of rich people and lots of fancy clothes and lots of wonderful food. And most people would have loved it. Most people did love it at those times. But St. Aloysius absolutely hated it. That was not the kind of life that he wanted. He hated fancy things. He hated rich things. He wanted to live a life of a person who chooses to be poor so that he can concentrate on God. So after he came back from this visit, he read even more. Not only did he pray, but he read even more about the lives of the saints, the kind of people who lived different kind of lives and didn't go around to fancy royal courts. One of the things he read about was missionary saints who went to India, people who didn't know about Jesus Christ and didn't know about the Catholic faith, and taught the poor people in India about the Catholic faith. And many of these missionaries belonged to a special order, a special group of priests and brothers who did a lot of missionary work, went around the world helping poor people in foreign countries and teaching them about Jesus. This particular group of priests and brothers was called the Jesuits, and they were a new order and they had a lot of energy. They were very big in missionary work. The Jesuits lived lives of poverty, which means that they didn't have a lot of fancy stuff. That's the kind of thing that he wanted. And they fought for God and worked all the time for God. They were out in the world. They didn't live in monasteries like monks and friars of the time did. And they promised to serve the Pope, and they promised to go anywhere in the world that the Pope wanted to send them. So they were almost like a spiritual army that belonged to the Pope. And Aloysius found this very, very attractive, as many people did in his time. But his father, remember, wanted him to go into the army. He wanted him to be a normal boy and live a normal life and like the kinds of things that he liked. So he would not give Aloysius permission. And Aloysius was very stubborn and argued with his father, and his father was very stubborn and argued with Aloysius, and it took them 4 years until they could reconcile. And his father finally gave up and said, okay, I agree, you can go into the Jesuit order. So he applied to the Jesuit order, and he was accepted, which meant that he had to spend years in the seminary studying to be a priest. So he went into the seminary, and when you go into the seminary in the Jesuit order, you have to do what Jesuits do. And one of the things that they do is promise to obey their superiors, in this case, his teachers and the people who ran his seminary, which is like a school for training priests. So he was studying to be a priest, and he had to obey his teachers at the seminary. And what his teachers asked him to do was to eat more. So they didn't let him fast as much as he wanted to. And they told him to pray a little bit less and do other things besides praying as much as he wanted to. And he had to obey these things. But he wasn't obeying these things because he was trying to have fun. He was obeying these things because he was promising to obey his superiors, and he wanted to learn that kind of life. So if somebody tells you not to be hungry but to eat, that's a nice thing. But actually for him, it was a hard thing because he had to give up his very strict life. But he was giving up his very strict life to serve God. And so this was a way for him to do penance, to actually eat more or to pray a little bit less, because this was the way that he was serving God, by obeying his superiors. Remember, he was in the 16th century, and in the year 1591, there was a horrible plague that struck Italy. Now, a plague is a disease that goes around and people die from it. And that's something that's familiar to us today, because we're staying at home right now so that we won't help to spread the coronavirus. And so the coronavirus you could call a kind of a plague, but a plague is usually far more serious. In other words, when we look out our windows, we don't see people dying in the streets. And plagues in those days killed an awful lot more people than the coronavirus did. And you could see sick people everywhere you went, and lots and lots and lots of people got sick. So this was a terrible plague. And as I say, he was in Rome at the time. That's where his seminary was. And so there was this terrible plague, and the Jesuits are Christians, and they're meant to serve their brothers and sisters as Jesus asked us to do, right, as missionaries, but also wherever they are in their home territory. And so since there was this plague, the Jesuits did what Christians have been famous for doing ever since we began, and that is starting hospitals for the poor people and the sick people in the city that no one else could take care of. So the Jesuits started a hospital for victims of the plague. And fancy, well-educated, brilliant Jesuits who would usually teach, including the superior of the Jesuit order, the head of all of the Jesuits, went and worked in the Jesuit hospital in Rome. And so did St. Aloysius, along with the other seminarians. And St. Aloysius loved serving the sick. So in the hospital, he would do things like washing them and making their beds. He was in close contact with them, which was a very dangerous thing because it was an easy disease to catch. And he was never a very strong young man, and so he ended up catching the disease, which he must have realized was very probable. So he got the disease, and he was very, very sick and had a fever and got weaker and weaker. But he knew in his heart, God had somehow told him, that it would take him 3 months to die. So he had a lot of time to pray. And now he was allowed to pray as much as he wanted. So he spent all the time in prayer. Whenever he was able to help other people by getting out of bed, he continued to do so. He got weaker and weaker, prayed all the time. And finally, at the age of 23, he died. And the church has told us that he's in heaven. So he is Saint Aloysius Gonzaga. And we should say, Saint Aloysius Gonzaga, pray for us, especially at this time. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.